Wyatt, it's 3 o'clock, so whenever you're ready, I'm good to go.
Great. Thank you for introducing me. Again, I'm Wyatt, and I'm here representing the Historical Society and the Kentucky Oral History Commission. I want to start off by saying it's 3 p.m. and I'm not trying to put anyone to sleep, so I'm going to be asking for some audience participation as we go through. I'm going to probably be asking for questions throughout the presentation as well as at the end. So I just wanted to prompt people with that. I'm hoping to keep it a little bit more lively. I know pretty much everything after 12, oftentimes I can start to feel a little slumped. So I'm going to try and keep it high and active. Today I'm going to be talking about oral histories. I have 2 big priorities. The first is to convince you that oral history is a great project form to participate in for a number of reasons, from outreach to history preservation in general, and also that it's a perfectly viable project for programming with youth. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I wanted to start with a pretty classic history question and ask people this vaulted question: if you could have a conversation with anyone, alive or dead, who would it be? Can I get some responses in the chat for that, and I'll take them as they come. We got any George Washingtons or Horatio Nelson? That's a great one. Mark Twain. Your grandma. I'll be talking more about that. I feel Ashley as well. Walt Disney probably would be a very interesting person to have a conversation with. We got a couple more. Oh. Okay. I'm glad a lot of you have mentioned your grandparents, because that was where I was going to come in. For me, it would probably be my grandfather. Unfortunately, not many, all 4 of my grandparents passed when I was quite young. So one of the things that prompted me to really get interested in oral history was this idea that as I started to learn and hear from elders I was experiencing, talking with, it occurred to me how many stories I had missed out on hearing from my grandparents, since I didn't have the opportunity to have those conversations with them. And to kind of add on to that, one of the most requested oral histories from our collection, the category that is people requesting oral histories that were recorded with their parents, grandparents, and other relatives. The number one thing that I get emails about on a day-to-day basis is people finding the name of their grandfather in our oral history repository and asking if they can hear their voice again. So family history and oral history are 2 things that are very closely intertwined and a really powerful reason for people to want to engage with it. So that's one of the reasons why I always like to kind of lead with that topic. And we've been collecting interviews since 1976. So as we depart from that date and continue forward, the amount of interviews we will start to have, not just the Kentucky Historical Society, but just in recorded oral history in general, will continue to grow and grow and grow and grow. There will probably be a point at which someone's great-great-grandfather or great-great-great-great-grandmother will have some sort of recorded history with someone somewhere. So as we go forward, that's going to continue to be something that's really something to be remarked about. There are lots of other kinds of oral history projects too, though. I just find family history to be one of them that's particularly resonant. So in addition to other kinds of collections, oral history is also useful for a number of purposes. I'm going to go over all of these in the presentation today, but just to kind of enumerate them at the top, oral history projects are also a great way to connect with people. either within organizations or outside of organizations to create new connections or strengthen existing connections. You can also use the materials that are collected from oral histories in different ways. So for example, you can use them for other products. And then lastly, after I've talked about a lot of this stuff, I will go over uh, some resources for how you can get started with conducting oral history, or who you might want to talk to if this presentation is interesting to you. So, and I thought I could do polls, but I'll just ask people to respond in the chat again. I wanted to get a quick gauge on how familiar everyone is with oral history. If you could just sound off a little bit, because I don't want to either over-explain or under-explain if I can help it. Okay. Familiar, but not an expert. Oh, stories and histories passed down via word of mouth. That's a good explanation. Okay. I kind of want to latch on to what Ashley has said here, the idea that oral history is stories and history that are passed down via word of mouth. That's definitely a really good description of oral history. I will want to add to that oral history has changed somewhat in the more recent past. So while oral history and oral tradition have been a consistent way of passing down stories and family traditions over long periods of time, since roughly that date I threw out there, 76, but even before then with the WPA oral history projects, has been attempts to specifically record either in transcripts or in audio recording some of these histories. So the way that's meaningfully distinct, in my opinion, is that although you could have oral history and oral traditions that go back thousands of years, people often raise this concern of stories being kind of modulated or changed over time. People talk a lot about the telephone effect. Whereas since the 70s and around that period, it's become a lot more common to want to preserve the stories by recording them in audio. And that way you can have a more or less concrete record of at least exactly what is said at every step of the telephone, even if it does change from link to link. But I'm glad to hear that at least everyone, it sees that that responded has some level of familiarity with oral history. So I won't get too into the details. Now I'm going to go over some of the different kinds of oral history projects. So the first one I already mentioned and have talked a little bit about, which are family histories. One of the things I want to mention about family histories is that oftentimes for family history projects, you're going to be doing life history interviews. So with life history interviews, you're typically, the scope of the interview is going to be asking someone about their entire life from start to finish. And this has been a pretty common form of oral history interview for a long time, although now the discipline has really diversified a lot. But it's still very common in family histories because, of course, if you're trying to preserve the stories of someone, like my grandfather and my grandmother, I'm going to want to try and get as much as I can about the whole life experience. One nice thing that I like about family history projects is that there's actually a really low barrier to entry. For one, your scope can be as small or as broad as you want it to be. You can have a family history, oral history project that is just your nuclear family, right? So it could just be you and your parents, or it could just be you and your parents and your grandparents. Or you could have one that's as broad as you go to a regular family reunion with, upwards of 30, maybe more people, and you try to get the stories of everyone at that gathering. So it can be wider or smaller. And oral histories that are intended to capture these life histories, I mentioned people wanting to hear the stories, to hear the voice of their family members again. So oftentimes audio quality is kind of secondary to making sure you just get it on tape, right? One thing that I would always suggest to people is that if you're waiting on getting the right audio equipment to record stories with your grandfather or something, don't wait. If you have a phone, you should try and do it. If you have ready access to oral history equipment, which I'll go to later and tell you how you can get some of that access, then I would suggest to do that definitely. But there's a very low barrier to entry to some of these projects. The last thing I'll note about family histories is that with any sort of family affair, it can be emotionally somewhat challenging to navigate, right? Because within families, there's often, emotional tensions or people who may or may not want to be recorded. And there's the added layer of people self-censoring some of their stories based on either who's interviewing them or who they think might be listening. So that's something that you might want to consider if you're thinking about doing a family oral history project with your family or with someone else's family. Does anyone have any questions specifically about family histories in oral history before I proceed? Okay. I will give it a 30 more seconds maybe before going on to our other types of oral history collections, but if I miss it, then you can still ask at the end of the presentation too. Ashley Hughes mentions their genealogy room in the prior comment, and family oral histories are also great for genealogical reference, whether they're transcribed or just in audio form. There's a lot of little details in there that can be very helpful. Okay. So the next kind of oral history project that you might often encounter are community histories. So most often this pertains to neighborhoods, groups, cities, regional places, and things of that nature. But it can really be any sort of community. It doesn't have to be locally bounded. But these are pretty common, right? So you might have a neighborhood oral history like a West Side Lexington oral history project, or a Louisville, City of Louisville oral history project. These are pretty common. And the goal of that is often to kind of get a ground up view of the history of an area, as opposed to trying to piece together history from documents or primary sources. So I would say the biggest asset of these community histories is that they really kind of bring people together. If you're trying to create a history of an area or of a community, you'll often run into people that you didn't previously know, or maybe that you hadn't gotten to know quite as well. And that can create new relationships within the same local area. So I've seen people who decide to do local oral history projects, and then all of a sudden they kind of spiral into all other sorts of different organizations and programming opportunities. And last, of course, is that community histories can often preserve usually forgotten stories. So for example, if there is I'll go with farmer markets because of this lady I've put on the slide. But if there's a farmer's market stall where there's a woman who consistently shows up at the farmer's market for 20 years and just sells really good apples, but no one really, they're not involved in any big organizations, but they're still a really important part of the community fabric. Something like a community oral history project is the sort of thing that would probably sweep them into the picture and say, okay, this person who runs this apple stall is like actually a really critical piece of the social fabric of this community, even though they might not be mentioned in newspapers that often. Any questions about community histories before I go on to the next slide? Okay. Oh, I did get one. Will there be discussion on how to conduct community histories? I will not have specific discussion within this presentation, but if you reach out to me, I would love to talk to you about it at as much length as you want, because that's really my background. Before I came to the Historical Society, I was involved with a community oral history project that became an organization that got engaged in housing advocacy and things like that. So that's really my bread and butter. So definitely contact me and we'll talk more about that. So the next collection I would say are things like themed collections, and I also think of these kind of as investigations. And they're a lot more research-based. I would say that these are very project-based collections, and oftentimes their intent is to figure out more about something that maybe the interviewer doesn't know as much about. They usually focus on a time. So for example, that would be something like the 70s. Yes, hopefully one of the moderators can do that while I'm speaking, drop my email again. So themed collections could focus on the time. So like I said, the 70s or 80s, they could focus on an idea. So an example of that would be doing an oral history project related to like gardening, for example. Gardening is something that has many different permutations, from urban agriculture, horticulture, to landscaping. And so doing an oral history project based on gardening could be something that is idea bounded as opposed to time bounded. And then themed collections can also be based on a certain activity. So for example, an oral history of skateboarding in Louisville, right? That would be an example of an activity. So you go and try and find skateboarders and try and knit their stories together that way. These projects are great for if you have like a research question that you're trying to flesh out and learn more about qualitatively. A great example is, I mentioned gardening, but that's a really good one, right? Because people often garden alone, even though they're working together, maybe either on social media or kind of sharing tips. But once you start to knit together what people are doing, you start to get a really broad picture of like the gardening movement, so to speak, as opposed to just a garden or like any of those other things. So themed collections you might want to do if you're trying to do something like that. They can also be really helpful for programming, and I'll get into that in one of my next examples. Any questions about themed collections? Could a themed collection focus on an event such as a past major flood or the time the president came to town? Yes, definitely, definitely. That would be a great example, because those events are things where you might know something about it, like a subsection of information. Like obviously the president came to town, you know that he came to town. But what that would allow you to unravel is all of the things that were attached to it, right? Like what did businesses do in order to like take advantage of the event and like drive up sales? Or what did people give to the president as gifts when they came to town, or things like that. And you could start to talk to people and get like that wider tableau of like how the event impacted the community. So that would be a great example. Okay, so in addition to those types of projects, I really want to hit home on how oral history projects can be great for community outreach and outreach in general. They can strengthen connections, as I said before, between people within an organization, between the organization and partners. They can help you reach new people, and they can also help bring new ideas into your library. And the way I want to illustrate this is through an example. So my example here is a book drive or a school supplies drive, right? Let's say your library, for instance, does a yearly drive where they try to collect school supplies and books in order to donate them directly to school teachers. Maybe in the past few years, donations have kind of been down, and you're trying to figure out what's really going on. So one of the things that you decide to do is have an oral history project with the people that the donations go to, the teachers and school children, in order to figure out how they've been benefiting from the program, B, what they could use better or worse, so like what sort of materials they actually need, and C, how other people feel or perceive the situation. So you sit down, you talk with these teachers, you talk with these school children, you collect maybe some video of these interviews, and you hear them talking about, oh, well, you know, we really need this supply because of these things that are happening, or we really need this amount of support that you might not expect. I really appreciate that the library has done this thing for these previous years. This person's really good. This does a number of things for you. The first thing it does is that it gives you a lot of qualitative information about the effectiveness of that program, right? Because you're starting to talk to people who are on the receiving end, and you have records of exactly what they like and do not like. It's like a really robust like review comment. The second thing that it does is that it gives you information about how you might want to change or steer the program. If there's something that really comes out in the interviews as, well, we've been getting a lot of pencils, but we actually don't need any pencils. That helps you know, okay, we don't need to ask for that anymore. And you can get a lot of that information out of surveys, but I think sometimes the issue with surveys as opposed to this method is that there's less room for getting surprises. Um, Things can come up in interviews that you might not have asked about at all in a survey. The other thing that this helps you do is that you now have material. If the school teachers sign off on allowing you to use any of this material, then you can use it for your promotional purposes to try and show potential donors why the drive is important. It's one thing for someone to be told this drive is important because it affects people in this way. And it's another thing for people to be able to see a video of a teacher saying, it really made the difference for this in my classroom that I was able to have this. And I thank the donors for that. And so it also connects you to potential donors and and strengthens connections between you and the people you're donating to. I've encountered a lot of, especially in nonprofits, and this will probably differ between libraries and different organizations, but a lot of times, especially with donations, it's a lot of drop off, right? Like maybe you have a consistent pickup of donations and a drop off, but maybe there's not always a good relationship or a relationship at all really between the people running the program and those on the receiving end. So it helps strengthen your library if you create those relationships, because suddenly you might have more volunteers, suddenly they know that you're interested in a really robust way, and you can get better information to better serve the people that you're trying to work with in a qualitative way, as opposed to things like surveys, which oftentimes don't give you as comprehensive a picture as getting information from a larger interview. So that's kind of one of my examples. And I'm not a librarian by trade, so I apologize if any of that is like slightly off kilter, but I wanted to try and create an example that was as library oriented as I could imagine. What else can you use with oral histories? You can make all sorts of other products with the permission of the narrators. So I've seen people use oral history interviews to make discussion-based podcasts, for example. So if your library wanted to put something like that out, you could have clips from oral history interviews that you then have either experts or community members discuss and put that out as a product. If you have video as a component of your oral histories, then you can produce short documentaries or, as I mentioned, promotional clips. Information from oral history interviews can be great for writing blogs. If you want to take partial transcripts from people's discussions, use that as a primary source in some of that information. And it's also great for potential social media blasts, right? You can include a clip from an oral history with the permission of the narrator announcing the next the next school supply drive, right? And that can help increase engagement because a video or an audio clip as part of your post might get more people to click on it than just a text post, for example. So these are all things to consider, that not only is the product of the oral history interview really useful, but depending upon the context, you can also use it as a base material for other productions. And so now, if any of this has piqued your interest, I want to go over some of the ways in which I can provide assistance or oral history can happen. So the Historical Society provides, upon request, oral history trainings in a few different categories. I can help train with interviewing, so the actual process of sitting down with someone, what are good questions to ask, what are not good questions to ask, how to put together your question list, everything like that. Project management, so how do you go from one narrator to a whole slew of 12 to 15 narrators? And then once you've done that, how do you kind of juggle scheduling and who might be the best to interview who and things like that. And then lastly, storage. What happens to the oral histories after you've completed the project? There are a lot of different options on that front. Lots of people who might be interested in family oral history projects might express an interest to a librarian, and sometimes I've seen that there's like a critical mass of, right, maybe like 4 or 5 people who are like, I want to do this, and maybe you don't know what to do about it. So I always like to do interest events where if there are a few people who are all interested in a similar thing, interested in oral history, I can come and kind of troubleshoot and like talk to them one-on-one in a small group setting. So I like to do that. If you'd like to schedule an interest event, I would love to do that. And I can also give presentations on oral history and conducting oral history that are a little bit more detailed on the process if you would like to schedule those as well. I'm currently in talks to do one in Louisville in the spring, and I'm really excited about that. So I would love to get more presentations on oral history at libraries on my calendar if people are interested. As for equipment, KDLA, the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives, offers oral history kits, and those can be loaned out either via interlibrary loan or if you directly contact KDLA. The Historical Society also offers kits, and these are the same format. So they'll roughly include a recorder, headphones, storage drives for the recorders, and a few other accessories. Everything you would need to kind of go ahead and get going with pretty good audio quality. And that program is really exciting that both KDLA and KHS are offering these kits. I've already worked with 2 or 3 different projects who have received them as technical assistants, and they're really going. So these kits really increase accessibility. I'll take this question from Caleb real quick. So he's asking, the trainings that I mentioned, are they targeted only at library staff? If, for example, we wanted to start an oral history project with our community, would you provide more of a general interest training open to the public? Yes, that's the kind of training that I'm offering in Louisville in the spring. And I've done that with a few other organizations. So I'm willing to train library staff, and I'm also willing to come to your library as a venue for a training for people in the public. Both of those are perfectly good for me. I will say that the loan agreement between KDLA and KHS is a little bit different. My understanding is that if you're getting a kit from KDLA, it's a little bit more like checking out a book through their adult thematic kits. And with KHS, you're either going to want to get a short-term loan, which is something that you would get for, like, if you wanted to do a one-off interview, we can give you a very short-term loan for like a couple weeks or something of the kit, or you'll want to apply for a technical assistance grant, which will basically involve you applying to receive the kit as part of a project where we will provide training and support for that. And again, if you contact me, I can provide more information about that grant. But you'll just want to, modulate who you're asking based upon the specifics of the project you're considering. Regardless of whether you want either of those kits, I'm also happy to provide equipment recommendations. So say if you are like, I don't know if I want either of those kits, I think I might have the resources to buy my own equipment. You can come to me and ask, what should I get? And I'll be able to give you a pretty good recommendation. Lastly, with storage, I wanted to throw out a few different options depending upon the resources of your library. Historically, some local libraries have kept oral histories within their collection. And in fact, I think I saw someone in the chat earlier say that there were oral histories at their library. So some projects, that may be what you want to do, depending upon your capacity. You can conduct these projects and have them stored at the library, especially if it's a community project. It would be great to keep community histories with community libraries. That, of course, like I said, depends on capacity, though, because some libraries, are small enough that if they collected these oral histories, they might not be able to effectively make them accessible to the public. And that's where I think some of these larger repositories come in. Universities allow the storage of collections upon request if they have an oral history program. So two of the big ones are the University of Kentucky's Louis B. Nunn Center and the University of Louisville's oral history program. But there are a few other around the state. I believe Northern Kentucky, EKU, some of these other universities also have oral history trusts that you can donate collections to, and that way they kind of take over a lot of the nitty-gritty about making them accessible. And then the Historical Society also is a repository for oral histories. We have over 10,000 interviews in our collection. And as I said, we've been collecting since 1976. You can request to have your collection stored with the Historical Society. Whether we want to take it or recommend a different location will depend on probably the nature of your project, but I would always prefer people ask than not. And lastly, I'll say, whether something ends up at a university repository or the Historical Society or in local storage, there's a pretty good chance you can find the interview on our website, Pass the Word. And the link to that is passtheword.ky.gov. I'll post that quickly. And that is the Historical Society's statewide guide for oral histories. We're kind of in a transitionary period now. We're working on a new version of the website, so there might be some broken links, but I highly recommend anyone interested in oral history still check it out and still see if they can find interviews that they're potentially interested in. And so I just kind of wanted to end there because it seemed like there were some more questions in the chat generally, and I may have skipped over some. So that's the bulk of my presentation, but I'm happy to kind of spitball some Q&A with people in the chat if they have more questions about oral history or resources that we provide. Thank you for all the great questions and comments I've gotten so far through the presentation. I appreciated people keeping me on my toes.
We still got a few minutes left in the session, so if you want to hang around and ask questions, you can. Or if you want to head out, you can do that as well. Thank you again so much to Wyatt for your presentation. There's a lot of interest. Oh, there's questions. So anyway, keep asking questions. Great. And we'll wrap up when we're done.
Do you happen to have a general question guide that can be used as a reference when interviewing about oral histories? We don't have a general question list. However, we do have a document called The Quick Guide to Oral History, which unfortunately did not think to include within our resources. But if you contact me, then I can provide that. And that gives you a process for coming up with a question list, if not necessarily a basic list. My personal opinion is that I like to come up with question lists based on the interviewee. So like if you have a project and you have a set list of questions that you ask every person the same questions, sometimes I find that you really miss out on asking specific people about specific permutations. I've recently been working with a project about the East Side, West Side neighborhoods in Lexington, and we were interviewing, I was working with someone who's interviewing a brick mason, and they didn't ask very much about the discipline of brick masonry because it wasn't on their question list, but it was clearly a really big part of their life history. And so that's one of those cases where I really wish they had made the question list for the person as opposed to had a standard one for the whole project. Ashley asks, do these trainings discuss offering interviewees visual aids to help get their memory flowing? You know, I actually don't have a lot of experience with that. I think that would, that sounds pretty interesting and I'd love to talk about it. I just don't usually use visual aids very much in my interviewing because particularly with potentially traumatic topics, visuals can trigger traumatic responses from people. It might be better if used in a context where you might not be discussing things that are potentially traumatic, but that's something that I've worried about in the past. What I can say is that one project I've done that was really cool was we had an event we called the History Potluck, which is where we asked people to bring stuff out of their attic, like old photos and documents and things like that. And they would bring them to us and we would scan them so they would have a digital copy of those documents. And then as they went through them, we would ask them about the pictures. So, someone would have a picture of them and their father and grandfather. And as we scanned that picture, we would ask them, so could you tell me about the people in the photo, like when this photo was taken, things like that. And that was a really good example of using visual aids to stimulate memory. I think what was good about that one was that the narrators brought the visual aids. We didn't bring the visual aids to them. But that was a great question. Thank you again, Ashley. Any other questions? I'm happy to hang out until the end of the time. I know I ended a little early, but I'm happy to continue answering questions. Oh, really? Well, if you ever need someone to help with that, to record you talking over it, I've done that before. So happy to help if you get in touch with me. And Amy thanked me, and I'd just like to thank Amy and all of the other moderators for hosting the conference. I've been hanging out in some of the rooms over the course of the day, and there's been a lot of great information. So thank you all again for that. Okay. Looks like we might be dwindling out a little bit.
Well, maybe we can say if they have any questions, they can email you, and they can email us if they can't remember your information, and we can help them get in touch with you too.
Yeah, that's great for me. I think that, yeah, like I said, I'm happy to answer any further questions over email or. So thank you again for moderating, and I guess we can go ahead and let people have the rest of their afternoons.
Absolutely. Thank you for presenting for us.
Thank you.